things used to break, and now they don't.
Things still break, it's just that it's much easier to fix them now.
The ability to unwind a bad release, we're much better at that than we ever were before. There's an increasing amount of trust. One of the things that's happened along with continuous delivery and software is actually much more nimble go-to-markets that are being built around businesses. It's a virtuous cycle where the continuous delivery capabilities actually allow you to evolve your business model too.
It's never the early vision, that's it.
It's more often being lucky than good.
Hi, I'm Paul Bigger, founder of Circle CI.
I'm Edith Harva, CEO and co-founder at LaunchDarkly.
And you're listening to Be Continuous, a podcast about continuous delivery and software development.
You can get in touch with us anytime at our Twitter handle @ContinuousCast.
The show is brought to you by HeavyBit. To learn more, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.
Hey, so what do you like about continuous delivery?
Continuous delivery, I think, really for me is an interesting kind of manifestation of a broader trend, which is about the ability for organizations today to move faster than they ever have before. It's really one of the things that helps drive nimbleness in software development, which ultimately, as more and more businesses are run through software, allows companies to be more flexible and quick-moving and, as you said, nimble than ever before. And that has profound implications in terms of the ability for these companies to innovate. So
now would be a great time for our guest to introduce himself.
Oh yeah, let's start there.
This is Scott Raney. I am a partner with Redpoint Ventures. Fire away.
Okay, so a company comes to you for funding and they release once a month.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I don't know that I would draw any conclusions based on, they release once a month. I think in the end, I think what's really important is that they're doing, I think what they feel is right for them and their ability to move quickly enough. It would be unusual today to have a company that's releasing once a month. I mean, we're obviously seeing, for the most part, companies that are releasing far more often than that. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily draw any conclusions because I would assume that these guys know the right pace for them for whatever reason. Obviously, one of the things that we see a lot is companies that are really being driven more and more by mobile, and that has their real issues and challenges associated with the ability to move quickly there, and some of the things that companies like LaunchDarkly are trying to help address. But I think the most important thing is we feel like it's a company that is set up to move as quickly as required to actually be able to drive the kind of innovation that we like to see. And we want to believe that they are an organization that's operating and building a software architecture and development pipeline that will be an asset as opposed to a liability.
I think that's a really good point you made. So I talked the other day to somebody who said, I asked how often they released, and they said 3 times a year.
Yeah.
My jaw kind of dropped. I'm like, well, do you want to release faster? And they're like, no. I'm like, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think if that's a pace that you and your customers are happy with, that's fine. I think it's the people who want to release faster but can't.
It's also like, if you're releasing enterprise software that's being delivered sitting on people's servers behind their firewall, then the release cycles need to be, more slowly because it has to happen in a way that the customers can absolutely absorb it. But obviously, more and more stuff is being delivered through as a service, and we would expect that release cycles would be much faster.
So I think even for enterprise software, I mean, when I look at why people delivering continuously, like it really started as developers just want to get their code out, and so in that world, I can see if you're releasing every quarter or 3 times a year, whatever, developers get pissed off, but it'll be fine. But where I'm seeing the vast or the majority of the impetus for continuous delivery is in customer validation and in being able to get like the feedback cycles of things. So if someone is shipping once a quarter, what is their feedback cycle like?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, it depends ultimately, too, on just what's being released as a part of these releases. I mean, how much new capabilities and new functionality is being introduced. You can release every day, but if it's something that's like you're changing the color on one page that's very deep down in the bottom of some service, who really cares, right?
Right.
So, again, I think it comes back that, maybe the way to think about this isn't how often you release, but how significant these releases are, how much you're actually changing and evolving the product, and in what cadence is that happening. One thing I would say is that what we're seeing, particularly for companies that have software behind the firewall, one of the trends that we've seen in the last couple of years is actually cloud-managed software. Right. So it actually looks a lot like SaaS. It's software. There's one code base. When there's a release, it's pushed out, and it's pushed out through all behind the firewall to these organizations, and there's a cloud layer that does all the management. which again facilitates allowing companies to innovate and release software much faster than they ever have been before. That's a bit of a side note, but I think it kind of reinforces one of the reasons that people are doing that is because they want a faster customer feedback cycle, but they also want to reduce the cost for organizations to own that software. And a lot of times that relates back to like if there's a new release, the whole process they have to go through to deploy it.
Well, you used to have this thing where you'd build software and then you'd branch off the software and you'd take that to release while development continues on the main branch. Right. And then you'd end up backporting these fixes for the key customers that were on those releases. And as Circle now makes on-prem software, and we ship it to customers, but customers stay on a more or less. There is one version of the software. There's no way that you'll be still running, or there's no way that we're backporting fixes to any of the old changes at all.
No, and I was very surprised when we first saw this trend emerging with a set of companies that were thinking about delivering software that way. I wasn't sure exactly how enterprises would react to it, but we've got 3 or 4 portfolio companies, and they get no pushback. And in fact, I actually think now it's an asset because it really does. They can say the total cost of owning the software is substantially less than it would be if if we were handing you software and you were deploying it yourself. And
wait. So you're saying if they're running it as a SaaS or if they're running it
cloud managed SaaS? So it's like software that's running on your hardware. You're my customer. You can run it on your hardware, but you don't manage it. I do for you. Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting trend because it allows us to kind of, sometimes there are certain customers or certain capabilities where customers don't want to move that information or the data or that workflow, that process to the cloud, but we can still deliver, we can still innovate and move just as quickly and efficiently as we can if we were a pure SaaS business as a vendor. So.
It's a lovely model because we've got a handful of customers that are on that particular model versus the pure on-prem. Yeah. And for us, we're doing auto scaling of very, very large fleets. And it's difficult to do that sort of auto scaling in a pure hands-off environment. So if we sell Circle on-prem and you have tens of thousands of machines that you want in this fleet, you're going to end up doing some sort of management. So the customers that fit that profile are, and I'd say this is still early stages, but we're managing their fleet that they pay for that's on their hardware. And it's just an easier model for them because we don't, and it's easier for us as well because we don't have to build this perfect software fleet management, scalability management, which is a very difficult challenge, and we have a little bit of flexibility like we do in the cloud service where there's an ops team that actually keeps an eye on that sort of thing.
So how do you price that? Do you price in the cost of your ops team managing these instances? Is this really turning into ops as a service?
I don't think it's quite ops as a service, but it's certainly leveraging the tools that we've built to manage the .com, which I would describe as more. It's not quite hands-on, but it's sort of human guided rather than just a pure software solution.
I think it's only slightly more expensive to support these customers than it is a cloud customer when you get right down to it, if you do it right and you build it right.
And in the end of the day, it's purely there are set margins that you have to get. So we will price it so that we get the margins that we're looking for. And it doesn't matter what exact way that goes.
Yeah, I like the idea. It's something that we're investigating at LaunchDarkly also.
Yeah, and there's companies like Gravitational, Replicated, and others that are helping take traditional SaaS businesses and help get them behind the firewall. I'm really excited to see where those things go because the reality is, the building that management layer. I think a lot of times people they try to tack it on later, and it's really, really hard to do that. You kind of have to think about it from the beginning. So.
And so, I was looking at the Replicated site today, and they have at the very start of their features, it's that they allow continuously deliver, or they allow software to be continuously delivered to their on-prem customers.
And because it looks and it should match exactly what your traditional flow is for whatever that their customer is, whether it looks like for their SaaS capabilities. So I don't know. We'll see what happens, but that's a new and interesting model.
So you see a lot of those kind of enterprise pitches and people. What percentage of your companies get any of that sort of pushback from more traditional enterprises?
What kind of pushback do you mean?
That continuous delivery doesn't work, or we want a longer release cycle and maintain branches, or all that sort of jazz.
Honestly, I'm not on the front lines having these conversations, but I'd say that is. Increasingly by far the exception versus the rule. I think that, again, it depends on how it's packaged.
Yeah.
And it depends on what it is. Like if it's a storage software subsystem,
Yeah.
that's very different.
Yeah.
Right. The considerations that go into thinking about release cycles there and all that stuff, the testing they have to do. I mean, that's more sophisticated. But even with that, we have a startup that's actually doing cloud managed storage, and
Right.
So I think that even that's evolving.
Well, I can't imagine shipping a box that that has software on it. Like, it just seems like such a challenge to keep that innovating.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is, and that's why, frankly, even in the storage space now, it's almost all software. They're almost all software businesses.
Right. So you talked about mobile, and that's still the interesting challenge that people have.
I think it's gotten a lot easier. Like
Do tell.
Like it used to be the average, and this is the average App Store review was 9 days. And if that's the average, that means that there's some much longer. I think Apple realized that this was really hurting them, and now the average App Store review is about a day and a half.
Wow.
Yeah, and they just announced that, I don't remember, I just read somewhere where I think now it's 2 to 3 day it's almost a 2 to 3 day commitment.
Yeah.
And so, but still, 2 to 3 days is 2 to 3 days. It's not like, it's better than it used to be, but it's still not what we think of as, kind of traditional web cycles. And
I think the important part of this is that there has already been a decoupling of software landing from feature being turned on.
Yeah.
So obviously looking in Edith's direction here.
Are you to tell me more?
So feature flags are this thing that.
Thanks for wearing your Lunch Darkly shirt today, by the way.
So it kind of doesn't matter that much anymore. Like if you're shipping software every 2 to 3 days for your mobile device, and you have feature flags behind it, you essentially have continuous delivery, because by the time you turn on the feature for hundreds of thousands of people, you've been gradually spinning that up over a couple of weeks.
The other thing to support is the auto updating that's happening on the mobile devices now too, which is like, it used to be that you release these things and you might get it every 2 to 3 days, but your end users aren't updating that often, and now that's less and less of an issue as well.
Yeah, that was the bane of our existence at TripIt. Like people on really, really, really old versions.
Yeah, and
Did
now
you
it's harder and harder
stop
to
them
do that.
working?
Oh, I mean, the thing is, consumers are consumers, and their version isn't working, and they're in, say they're on a business trip to Brazil.
Right.
Like
They can't just auto-update over the...
They're just pissed off at us that something isn't working, and it's hard to get an update because you're traveling. So auto update helps because then you can do it auto and not at the point of pain, which for a travel app was usually when you're out of the country and already in pain and in a hurry.
I'm surprised there was ever an option to manually update. Like, what was the point there?
Well, I think people are so burned by like the whole Windows 10 update that's going on right now, where like Windows 10 has this massive update that is killing a lot of people's computers.
Oh, wow.
Well, I also think that in the early days too, I think it's an artifact of the decisions that were made, back in 2007, 2008, which is like, you didn't want people to actually burn through their data plans too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You have to realize that there's a responsibility you have, and that the end user is actually paying for all the data that's being consumed. So, but that's obviously become less of an issue now as data rates have gone up.
I've always seen that this idea of you really want to have control over your software, on the one hand, you can look at it as like a free software foundation, view of the world where you want to have control over everything that runs on your device. But still, you hear people who are just like, I want to know what version is installed. I care about what updates are installed. And frankly, I don't understand any of it. I want to see none of that.
I think some of it comes from a place of fear. Like if you remember when stuff broke all the time, and you're like, I just want a stable version. Mm-hmm. That's why people want to know. If you have trust, then you don't really care.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Like for a website, like what time do you ever look at like a SaaS product and ask what version it's on? No.
Right.
Why do you agree?
Yeah, because I think things used to break. I mean, honestly, and now they don't. I think part of it is that we've gotten a lot better as an industry at doing all these things, and so I think people.
It's almost like there's a correlation between continuous delivery and the things not breaking as much.
Well,
there might be. There's a relationship. You guys ought to do a podcast about it.
We ought to have a guest named Scott. No, I think that things still break. It's just that it's much easier to fix them now. Mm-hmm. Because like in the example you're just giving of having a physical box somewhere,
right? If
something broke, you would have to go physically update that. Yeah. Like it was in
the sooner you can fix it, the sooner.
Yeah, I saw this great talk. I was at Continuous Lifecycle London. It was this lady who used to physically solder programs into cash registers. So, I mean, if there was a bug...
Okay, that is the exact opposite of what we're talking about here today. Right?
Yeah.
So like money things?
Like
is that what you mean?
Yeah, like a cash register has
Okay.
programs in them, and to
Okay.
update the program, you would physically take a chip and solder in the new program.
So I thought we were talking like parts of the CPU. There's the cache, there's the registers. And
Oh, no.
in some sort of...
This is literally cash, CASH.
Good clarification.
Yeah.
In case our listeners at home were wondering which it was.
But I think a lot of that was the original software.
Right, yeah.
You know, it was just one step up from the physical hardware, and so there's a lot of legacy of it needs to be perfect because it's going to get placed everywhere.
But I tell you, what's interesting is just how quickly I think big enterprises are changing the way they look at that, and I actually think that it bodes really well for the startup ecosystem and for innovation, and that there's an increasing amount of trust, and I think that's a phenomenal thing and a great catalyst for all of us here.
Do you have any stories of enterprises or anything you can share?
I don't know that I have any specific stories other than I can just tell you, as I said, anecdotally in our businesses, that are going to enterprises, the way that they do release processes now has changed.
When did you see that tipping point?
I would say probably 2 to 3 years ago is when it started happening, and maybe kind of 1 to 2 years ago it was like this idea, for instance, of cloud managed software became more widely accepted. I also think Amazon AWS has been a big part of this, which is actually just this idea that it's obviously very different, but the idea of relying on a third party for some kind of element of cloud managed software and infrastructure has kind of changed the way that people think about expectations.
It's made things a lot cheaper and easier.
Yeah, it's that for sure, and it's also just like it used to be that we had to run our own hardware, and now we can turn over all that infrastructure over to somebody. So hey, you know what? It's not that big of a deal if somebody wants to update. If we can do that, then if somebody wants to update software on the fly for us, they can do that.
There's an interesting parallel to in Jeff Bezos's last annual report or letter or something. He talked about the difference between type 2 decisions and type 1 decisions.
Yeah.
Type 1, I can never remember which is 1 and 2, but let's call 1 the one that is very, very difficult to change. And you have to put an awful lot of forethought and planning into it. And type 2 is the decision that's very easy to change.
But that we spend the same amount of time on type 2s as we do type 1s a lot of times, even though one is easy to unwind, right?
Yeah. And so I think where you get this thing of trust, it ties a lot to type 2 decisions, and the same thing with like a box that you ship into data centers, a type 1 decision, or soldering into cash registers.
Well, maybe that's one of the reasons why. I mean, the ability to unwind a bad release is we're much better at that than we ever were before, and part of it is through all the stuff we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, I mean reversibility.
Yeah.
I hate plugging my own company, so usually I let Paul do it. But feature flags are really about reversibility.
Yeah.
The fact that you can always roll back very quickly to a known good version without having to redeploy.
Right.
And it creates a lot of freedom.
Yeah. So hey, you know what? Maybe it wasn't perfect. Well, the reality is the cost is low because we can get it back to where it was before.
Yeah.
There was a blog post I wrote several years ago about the Amazon Kindle on iOS disaster. So Kindle released a new version on iOS that deleted all their customers' libraries.
Well, Apple does that on purpose now. They do.
Yeah.
It's a feature, not a bug.
It deleted their cloud libraries, not just the music that they had on their phones. What happened was Apple fast-tracked Amazon's new version of Kindle, and a day later the disaster had been kind of largely averted. But it was a disaster, I feel, that happened in the first place because of the lack of continuous delivery. That they have to ship this big release. They probably shipped it every month or something like that, and the confluence of several different decisions had to be made at the same time. So there's a big kind of like type 1, are we going to ship this decision? Because there is no type 2, let's immediately and very quickly roll it back. And the result of that is a whole bunch of software that goes out together that has unintended consequences.
Yeah, the n² problem with all those features, like, how does it work?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, but we were talking before about kind of the Air Force jet disaster. I like Scott's description of it.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what part of the description you like, but I mean, it's just interesting to me that this is a 10 to 15, 20-year project that's gone on, and the scale and scope of it. It's basically just something that it's just trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody. As a result, it's not really good at anything that it does. And it's when you do 20-year release cycles, that's what happens. You spend $1 trillion on something that in the end is not nearly as good as maybe even its predecessors of many of the capabilities that they were looking for. So it's I would love to believe that there's the concept of continuous delivery and deployment that would be possible for projects at that scale, but I don't know.
I mean, it sounds almost like, and I don't want to suggest that this might actually be the case, but it sounds like it might not actually be in people's interests to deliver a working product versus continually pumping money into the.
Well,
I wouldn't like to suggest there's any sort of political or lobbyist motivation behind this thing at all.
So I grew up in DC. I'll briefly defend DC. I do think people want to see successes. I mean, like Healthcaregov was an awful egg in the face for all involved. Nobody came out looking good. And it wasn't like, oh, you screwed up, here's more money to fix it. They brought in a completely new team and started over again with very much
that was a
processes.
sort of a difference in how previous plans had gone. So normally when that thing happens, you just keep money pumping into it until someone gives up, and then the same team gets deployed to a different part of the government to get hundreds of millions of dollars of damage.
Yeah, I think the sad thing is, so the extent of the jet thing is that they can't even take off. It's not like they have a sporadic glitch that might affect them. It's that like literally these are, $1 trillion paperweight.
One of the kind of comparisons that people always make is real engineering products to software engineering or processes. And you start to see in the real world a little bit more of continuous delivery like creeping in. So you look at the hardware startups in Shenzhen, for example, that are changing the cycle time from you might get a prototype in a week here if you're lucky, and if you're a different part of the world you might get it in a month. In Shenzhen you get it in a day. You're missing a component, you go down to the component market and it's a multi-block warehouse that sells you the exact component you need, and you can get that cycle time down really, really low.
Yeah. It's also that so many of we look at a lot of hardware projects too, and so much of it now is being done in software. So what you really look for is almost like this generic hardware platform that allows you to build software capabilities such that if you do make mistakes or there are issues or there are antenna problems, et cetera, hopefully many of those things can be fixed in software.
Right.
But sometimes that's just not possible.
Have you ever seen a company just go completely awry with an Air Force type disaster?
I have. I'm not going to. I won't mention names. I haven't seen it in a long time, honestly. In terms of I've seen companies do that where it's not the software or the product as much as it is maybe the way they thought about building the business, and maybe one of the things that's happened along with continuous delivery and software is actually much more nimble go-to-markets that are being built around businesses that allow you to solicit feedback much more readily and actually do it much more efficiently.
Them earlier.
Yeah. You're able to validate them earlier, but also it's not the top-down, long sales cycle that there's more bottoms-up that allows you to get feedback and then tune your go-to-market, which obviously then rolls back into your product. And, it's a virtuous cycle where the continuous delivery capabilities actually allow you to evolve your business model too. But, so it's rare that we see companies just kind of fly right off the end of the runway or right into the cliff in the way they used to. But it still happens from time to time.
I see a bunch of it.
Good.
Yeah. So I talk to very, very early stage startups that are, their question is how do we raise money sometimes, or we're running off our savings, and for a lot of them that have done, and a lot of times my answer is you don't have product market fit and you need to validate and iterate your way there, and so I do see people who are running off whatever meager savings they have because they never learned the lessons of the lean startup, of continuous iteration, of validation. But I think that's mostly hopefully kind of taken care of by the time they hit any sort of traction or product market fit. They don't get that far. They don't get to pitch
rare,
you.
Yeah, typically a lot of that is the very initial part of product market fit. The reality is product market fit is it's not a one. It doesn't happen all at one time. It happens over a period of time.
And it's never the early vision. That's it. So you have to be good at iterating to get there.
The market itself changes.
Well, yeah.
Things like if you tried to build an app 10 years ago, people were trying to build app 10 years ago. It's just the carriers made it impossible to put them on.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we funded number of businesses that did that, and not easy companies to build.
Yeah.
I guess you're kind of in the business of funding a lot of people who are ready for something that hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah.
And so like, if you don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but if you don't know exactly how or when the thing that they rely on is going to happen, so they need to be constantly iterating and constantly validating to get that right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes, unfortunately, the market, they're just too far ahead of the market, which is, there's no amount of iteration and amount of nimbleness is going to help you in that situation if customers just aren't ready to, for whatever reason, kind of embrace the value proposition you put forward.
It was very interesting around the start of Circle CI. So there was companies that were like 2 years ahead of us that died.
Yeah.
Or in one case that pivoted to a different product. And then companies that started about a year after us, it was too late. The market was kind of, or the opportunity was closed.
Yeah.
And so like the too early, too late, like there was one sweet spot, and it's not like we knew it, or we knew why. In retrospect, we can look back and we can say it was the tools, and it was the freedom of allowing your source code to escape that made that the thing. But you can't tell it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some real examples from Scott, if he can say anything without breaching confidentiality.
About
companies that were too soon, too late, didn't have product.
I'm always terrible about being able to drum up things in real time.
Just advice you'd give because you're a board member.
Yeah, I always want to be respectful of folks, because the reality is, one thing I can tell you about this timing thing is it's more often being lucky than good. Sometimes being really good allows you to time it right because you just really understand all the things coming together. A lot of times you just timed it. You just got lucky that you timed it really, really well. The thing that the feedback that we give all the time though now, and this is very different than it was even like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, is that you can get so much more feedback on product and product market fit earlier with less money than you ever before, that you're crazy not to do it, and so the definition of minimal viable product, at which point you can go out and actually start collecting this feedback, is always the hard thing. It's like, where's that line? Like, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable? What's enough and what isn't? That's an inexact science, and sometimes, companies will make mistakes about not putting in enough or taking too much time. But we just spent a lot of time sitting around board meetings talking about how can you go out and can you get the product in front of folks and start to solicit real feedback, even at the expense of thinking about revenue. So, I think that once you've raised a little bit of venture money, you kind of have the luxury of actually being thinking a little bit more long term. And it gives you the ability to actually spend time thinking about, for instance, like any developer facing business, our feedback is always get developers to love it, win over the hearts and minds of developers, and then worry about monetization later, right? And with a little bit of venture money, it's easier for companies to do it. It's frankly easy for me as a venture guy to tell entrepreneurs to do that, and it's sometimes a very harrowing experience. But what you want more than anything is to get a bunch of people using your product and loving it. And more often than not, if they really love it and they're using it and engaged in it in a really meaningful way, there's a business model to be layered on top of it. So, that's not a great model for all companies, but certainly for ones that, the ones that I spend a lot of time on that are selling through developers to other people and organizations, the most important thing we can do is just build something that folks love. The other thing that I would say is, one really interesting dilemma then is, we've talked about this before, but these companies that actually use developers, and because through continuous delivery, developers are playing a bigger and bigger role in selecting the components of the infrastructure that's actually used to build not only the product, but also that the businesses run on. That, what you want to do is you want to win over the hearts and minds of developers, getting them to use it. But at some point, you have to trigger in your business the ability to actually market to the people that ultimately will be paying for the product. And how do you simultaneously run a marketing campaign organization that's winning over the hearts and minds of developers while convincing product managers or CFOs that they should be paying for a product that has kind of made its way into the stack through the developers? And that's a really challenging exercise to go through. So,
GitHub had this concept that they called the clamp, that's coming from the bottom and coming from the top at the same time.
Yeah.
So when you're a company that's like GitHub, and I mean this is several years old, but even by then they were huge, and they were able to go for the top down CIO sale at the same time as they were doing the bottom up. But I think if you're if you're a much smaller company, that there's much more of a challenge of getting that.
Yeah, and I would argue by the time they started executing on the clamp that they had won over the developer ecosystem.
Oh yeah, all of it. Yeah.
And so, again, that's kind of back to saying once you win over those folks, then the amount of leverage you have in those conversations is very, very different. And so I don't think the right way is to think about coming from the top and then eventually kind of try to build up the bottom.
Yeah.
And that's an obvious statement, but frankly, it's amazing in the heat of war how many times companies make mistakes on that front.
Like, do you mean, are you always a favor of going bottoms up then, or?
I'm not always. It depends on the business, and obviously, what I'm talking about a lot of here is kind of these developer-facing businesses. And so there's certain cases where that doesn't make sense. Again, like some core enterprise infrastructure businesses, that's not a bottoms-up game. But I do think and in a lot of SaaS businesses, it's not going to be a bottoms-up. But I do think that anytime where you're building something that's kind of democratizing some capability in some way, the best thing to do is to get as many people using it as possible, and then you'll find that it's much easier to monetize. But it requires generally for these companies to hire on some different capability, the ability to kind of exert that pressure from the top. Sometimes that's an unnatural act because you're dealing with folks, and many times the people that are building these products are developers building for developers. So.
I certainly see both sides. I mean, at TripIt, we were hugely successful because we had all the individual travelers, and then travelers also have budget because by their very nature, usually almost always somebody's traveling because they're important.
Yep, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So you spoke on was it Tom's podcast a while back, and I was listening to that. It was great. And if you're listening to this, you should go back and listen to Scott being on Tom's podcast.
That's why I wanted to have him on ours because I was like, wow, I'd love to just talk dev tools for a while.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting was you separated the developer tool ecosystem into like 4 bits, and one of them was APIs around existing products. And it seemed really interesting to me that we're talking about bottom up versus top down. When you think about the mechanism by which software takes over the world or software eats the world, whatever it is, that it's those companies that do exactly the same thing but have an API on it that is sort of the front line of those transition from the older companies to new companies and being disrupted just by having an API that the developer picks. And so by the time they I think you said this, by the time there's a decision to be made, it's already been made.
Yeah, and typically those are commodity capabilities and features. So, Twilio and Stripe and other things like this. The reality is not commodity in the sense of not really hard to do because it's very hard to deliver those capabilities. But more often than not, you're not going to win or lose based on your ability to better execute integrating voice or text into it than the next guy. So, what you don't want to do is spend your valuable engineering and developer resources recreating something that in the end probably won't allow you to win in whatever segment you're in, but are absolutely important and essential parts of the overall experience. And when you could find those things, and it also helps when you find those things that actually have natural business models attached to them, where it's well understood that you pay for the consumption of those capabilities, and you can build extraordinarily powerful businesses. So.
I love the background checking as an API.
Yeah,
it's just such a good model. Like exactly as you say, like you're used to paying for background checks.
Yeah, and the reality is
it's not your core to your business.
Yeah, and it's not like one company's going to be better at background checking. That's going to allow you to differentiate. And
Lyft isn't going to beat Uber by flexing its background checking muscle.
Exactly.
Well.
But you got to be.
All right, maybe.
But you got to be good at it. I mean, the bottom line is you got to be really, really good at it. But it's typically not the basis of competition.
Yeah, it's table stakes.
Yeah. So we love finding those types of companies. The reality is they're not as plentiful. There's a lot out there, but it's hard sometimes to find the ones that have the big scalable business models attached to them. But look, if you ask me kind of going into the future, when you kind of look at a typical application that's been built, how much of it will come from API service like that versus stuff that's built, custom for that application? I say increasingly there will be more and more that will be delivered through these API services, and these.
And they're all consumed bottom up.
Well, I think in the end that is the best path to success because you're not going to convince developers. Typically, it's hard to convince developers to do something. They have to kind of want to do it themselves, and so. But I also think that what ends up happening is somebody's tasked with you need to build this capability, and they're like, why should I? That just seems crazy that There's got to be some way, and increasingly there's got to be some way I can just find an API to do that. What's really cool is that's, I think, almost like for many things now, the default question that a developer asks, is there an API that can do this for me?
Well, do you think it's kind of an outflow of the whole Stack Overflow thing, where it's like, I'll just Google that?
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
there's
I'll just use an like, why?
I think it's like the whole thing that's driving, I think, microservices to a certain extent. It's like, look, people want to like focus in on the stuff that really matters to them and their company.
Right.
And
I think there's a natural analogy between a microservice and a third-party company that is providing it.
yeah.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, that's why people are coming to my and Paul's company is they're like, well, we know we need this.
Yeah.
We don't want to build it.
No. Yeah. And the reality is you'll build it far better than they would. Anyone that goes out and tries to do what Twilio is doing right now, I mean, good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. They've got several hundred engineers building capabilities to deliver a really compelling set of services that are global in nature, that are route optimized. I mean, it's like good luck trying to recreate that, but it's not threatening in any way to kind of absorb that into your capability.
Well, there is an interesting counter swing where like Dropbox just moved everything back in house.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's your take on that as a competitive advantage?
In terms of the infrastructure side? Yeah. So I think you get to a point where in many cases, I mean, this is a different conversation, but we've heard this again and again, but I do think that if you're an organization that has kind of predictable loads and you're not optimizing for peak capacity, when you run the numbers, it can be cheaper to run your own infrastructure. And as a guy that loves the cloud, it's like, it's like I say this with a great deal of humility, but there are a number of companies. We've seen a bunch of companies who come in and they pitch to us and they're negative gross margins, but they say, we're going to move off of Amazon, we're going to bring it in-house. Right. And we've seen 2 or 3 companies that have done it that have gone from negative gross margins to 60, 70% margins in the span of months. But it really, I think that makes sense for a subset of companies out there with a particular workload. Either they're very I/O intensive or they're highly predictable, where you can capacity plan and you can drive high levels of utilization.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. It's just, what are you outsourcing? What are you insourcing?
Yeah.
Like here at HeavyBit, we've outsourced our office.
Yeah.
And eventually,
it's a nice one too.
Yes.
try replicating this one on your own. Yeah.
So when you're looking at people who say, "Oh, we're going to bring this on-prem," how do you know the difference between someone who has no idea what they're talking about and someone who's actually going to do this?
Meaning that they are making the right business decisions, or meaning that they are capable of bringing it on-house and running it as efficiently as they need to?
I guess a bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, like, how do they know that when they get there, their margins will be what they expect them to be?
Yeah, it's actually, I've gone through this a couple of times and gone through this exercise. We've walked through it, and it typically, when you sit down and they go kind of walk through the numbers, it's actually not that complicated of a spreadsheet. It becomes obvious.
Right.
And again, it's like I described some of the characteristics that might drive people to make that decision. Sometimes the bigger question is, are they going to be like, okay, so you have baked into that a set of assumptions on just how efficient you can be at running that infrastructure. Will you be able to be that efficient at running that infrastructure? Are you good enough? Do you have a good enough operations team to do that? And obviously, that's a big part of the assessment we would do as a part of a diligence process.
Yeah.
We did the same thing. I mean, it was literally a spreadsheet, and we got it down to what is the cost of a CPU error, and what is our intuition around what the cost of a CPU error can be. And the thing that you want to be careful about when you do this is that you're not undermining all the operational flexibility that's introduced by continuous delivery, right? That okay, now we brought it in-house, but man, when we want to launch a new capability, a new feature, a new whatever, now we're stuck in that old process of we got to bring in some hardware and we got to deploy that and scale that. Like, are you undermining your ability to move quickly? And this is something that that's a conversation you have to have with folks and make sure that they're building the capabilities, modern capabilities for software deployment to ensure that they can do that hyper efficiently. So. When we launched our CI for OS X, we moved from our CI for Linux runs on Amazon, so we want a new machine. That's an API call. We moved it into we want a new machine. That's an email and a couple of days and an invoice that needs to be signed. And the difference between the speed at which we're able to get new capacity, like the OS X thing sat in beta for quite a long time, as we just constantly added new machines all the time for the new customers that were coming in. It grew so quickly that we were never anywhere near hitting that capacity, and so we were I think we were in beta for a year on that as a result.
Yeah.
And then once we kind of got it to like the level where it didn't take a human on our end, it got to be a lot faster that we could provision, but it was still never, it's never going to be the Amazon speed.
I think the thing that, the decision, when you make this decision, if you're going to move off of Amazon and run it on your own infrastructure, it needs to be something that you have to do based on economics as opposed to something that you want to do. Like, a lot of these companies, if you're trying to squeak an extra 5 to 10% of gross margin out, that's on the edge of maybe it's worthwhile, but probably only when you're really significant in size and that 5 to 10% really matters. A lot of the companies we see doing it are doing it because their business model's upside down.
Right.
And, because I think that the flexibility you get from Amazon and the capabilities, all that stuff, when you can focus on the things that really matter, you can invest your resources, in places that will drive long-term differentiation. That's where we'd rather see our companies spend their time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's something that you do when you're mature and trying to eke out margin rather than when you're trying to innovate and grow very quickly.
Yeah, except there are cases, even in the early stages, based on the nature of their workloads, where you kind of have to do it. But that's, I think, the rare exception as opposed to the rule.
Well, it's optimization rather than growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, our advisor, Sean Burns, was at Flurry.
Yeah.
And he always laughs. He's like, you're going to build your own data center, Edith. Someday.
Yeah. That's something we should all aspire to with all our companies at some point, to be big enough where we want to build our own data centers.
Well, so he's like, not right now, but in a couple of years, you're going to come to me for advice. I'm like, I know.
Then we got to talk to the big CIOs of the Fortune 500 companies, and they're trying to figure out how to get out of their data centers. So the real answer is somewhere in the middle, I'm sure.
Maybe they can sell them to Dropbox.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully I can sublease their data centers for very cheap. Well, we're almost out of time, but we loved having you as a guest. Do you have any final thoughts?
No. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of To Be Continuous, brought to you by HeavyBit and hosted by me, Paul Bigger of Circle CI, and Edith Harbaugh of Launch Darkly.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. While you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.